Good evening, everybody. I'm pleased to see how many we've got, and would hope that we might get a few more for our April meeting. It was convenient for us to make it this one a Zoom meeting because our speaker comes from Adelaide and you're not using fuel. So it's a win-win situation, I think, all around. Tonight, since I've got nothing specific to talk about, other than tonight's meeting, I'd like to introduce Peter Ingman, uh, a researcher, writer, author, publisher. He does it all. And tonight, Peter is going to talk about the RAAF in South Australia. It's not a subject that we know a great deal about. I'll pass you over now to Peter.
Yeah, thanks for the kind introduction, Bob, and also Peter. Done. Let me share this PowerPoint. So this talk, the Royal Australian Air Force in South Australia during World War II, it was based on a book that I began researching probably over 10 years ago, and probably like all of you, it's a subject that just is barely covered anywhere, and there's been very little written over the years. So that's what sort of attracted me, and also I think that the story of what happened here in South Australia, it's one that sort of reflects the national experience to some extent as well, and probably lots of lesser known places in New South Wales and Victoria and so forth. So this is me with a tie on, Bob. That'll make you a bit happier. And I was launching the book on the centenary of the RAAF back on the 31st of March 2021. And the gentleman with me that kindly launched the book was the then Governor of South Australia, Hugh Van Lay. And there was a ceremony and then a sort of a morning tea at Government House to celebrate the centenary of the RAAF, which was a wonderfully attended and put on function. But Canberra didn't want it to happen. In the weeks leading up to it, they were very nervous about it because of all the different COVID laws around Australia. And so it went ahead, but with the proviso that the official photos, there was virtually someone with a tape measure making sure we were socially distant. So that's why I'm a couple of meters away from the governor. So just Bob gave a bit of an introduction about me. A lot of you would be familiar with my company, Avonmore Books. So I'm an author and publisher. We do a lot of Pacific War aviation related titles. I've written some, but I'm doing less and less of that nowadays. I'm also the chairman of the history group of the South Australian Aviation Museum. And my first book was released back in 2010, and it was a bit of a hobby back in those days. And since then it's become a business. So this is the book once again, and then they say always start with something a little bit lighthearted. So this is a map of the RAAF establishments in South Australia at the start of World War II, and obviously there was nothing here, nothing whatsoever. And this is a map of everything that was developed during the war. It's a bit hard to see all the detail, but just be aware there's quite a few establishments around and near Adelaide, and then a number of airfields and other stuff around the state that we'll talk about shortly. So an overview of the talk, the main stuff was the training establishments, Adelaide, Parafield, Port Perry, Mallala, Mount Gambier, and Victor Harbor. There were some operational units here as well we'll talk about. Also the deaths in South Australia and the history of sort of what happened with those and how the training evolved from something that was quite dangerous into something that became a lot safer towards the end. And also what remains today of these bases, which I think other people have seen the talk find quite interesting. So most of you will be very familiar with the Empire Air Training Scheme, so I won't talk about this in a great deal, but it was a brilliant piece of long-term strategic planning. Britain needed 50,000 pilots for this planned air force, but it could only train half that number itself. So the answer was to start up training in dominions such as Canada, Australia, I think Rhodesia and New Zealand as well, where there was ample clear skies for training, free of the Luftwaffe, and lots of keen recruits. And a key role really for the RAAF at the first 2 years of the war was really in this eats training. So again, this is a map from the RAAF official history, which lots of you would be quite familiar with. And so this shows, it's only in December 1941, but it shows the country littered with dozens of these bases that were started up very, very quickly. And I think just a handful of locations here were permanent bases that existed at the start of the war, being maybe Amberley, Richmond, if it's there, and Point Cook and Laverton, and pretty much the rest of it was all courtesy of this massive EATS development. So why were these locations picked for these bases? Most were small country towns. Many were in the New South Wales riverina, which the RAAF rated as having the best year-round flying conditions. And additionally, those Victoria, New South Wales sort of riverina locations, but they were close to all the populations from Sydney and Melbourne for weekend leave. And the RAAF liked the Duntroon model of having a specialised training in a sort of a country setting. I thought that worked really well. And of course, lots of the senior at the start of World War II were probably originally Duntroon graduates, being from the army originally. They wanted to railways so they could get bulk fuel there and other supplies. They also needed the infrastructure of the towns, the water, the power, the sewer, and businesses to supply all the fresh produce, the food, and so forth. But they couldn't set these things up out in the desert because they wanted grass-covered runways, basically a paddock-style landing field. So it had to be somewhere where the grass would grow all year round. So that's why they weren't in really, really sort of outback locations. They also wanted it surrounded by flat farmlands, so there'd be lots of emergency landings in this training, and then there was some bombing and gunnery schools, such as at Port Pirie, where they needed a certain type of coastal sort of area for the Rangers. So this is a newspaper cutting of, I think this is Malala, and it shows, you know, basically this base going up like a Meccano set very quickly with hangars and dozens of huts. And so often these things would spring up literally within months, and then they were training and outputting graduates. And you have 1,000 or 2,000 people on this base, often overshadowing a town nearby of just a few hundred. And this is another picture of RAAF Malabar. To me, it sort of looks like a Hogan's Heroes camp, maybe a POW camp, more than somewhere you'd like to be. I guess it was modern back in those days, but it must have been brutally hot in summer and very cold in winter. This is an overhead shot of Malabar. There were basically, you can see the township in the top left, and then the base itself is just a couple of miles from the town. There were two massive aprons for the training planes, the Ansons. There was about a dozen hangars. And then in the middle, there was the sort of all the huts, administrative and housing huts built around a parade ground. So it was quite a large sort of infrastructure that was put together very quickly indeed. So strangely, the biggest base of all by the amount of people trained was one you've probably never heard of. This is the number 4 School of Technical Training, which was in the city of Adelaide, and called the Exhibition Building. And 22,000 people were trained there, and these were basically all the maintenance crews and people that worked on these bases, thousands and thousands of them. And obviously, there were various other campuses and stuff, some of which haven't been fully researched yet or are lost to history, but obviously there must have been other training locations like this all around the country. Victor Harbour was home to number 4 initial training school, and this is where all the air crews went when they were basically civilians selected for aircrew training. And this was before the war. It was a luxury hotel with a golf course attached. And I think at the start of the war, when the local sort of Navy, Army and Air Force officers were getting together and requisitioning properties for the war, and I think the Army requisitioned the showgrounds and so forth. And there was a few eyebrows raised when the first thing the Air Force wanted was a luxury boutique hotel with a golf course. But To be fair, that probably reflected the sort of Dunfermline model that they wanted, to have these schools isolated. And Victor Harbor is sort of a resort town about an hour south of Adelaide. And this number 4 initial training school, these were set up all around the country. They took in the training air crews. They had courses of about 8 to 14 weeks. And after that, they went to their basic flying training. This Mount Brecon also became quite a large WAAF training centre. I think they, when it was disbanded towards the end of the war, it had trained about 5,500 air crews and 2,500 WAAFs. And so that's one of the many graduation photos of one of the classes of graduates taken there. And so the first of the training bases we look at is Archerfield, which most of you would be aware is sort of the general aviation facility at Adelaide. But back in those days, it was Adelaide's main airport. And like many of these airports in those days, it was almost in a bush setting. It must be about 15 or 20 kilometres north of Adelaide, I think, from memory. So all of those hangars in a line, you can see they were all sort of pre-war airline infrastructure, and there's a tower building as well that you can just see it was built in quite a famous Art Deco style. I think it was completed in about 1940. And so all of the huts and everything you can see in that square on the left, that was all of the number 1 elementary flying training school that was based there. So prior to the war, this was one of the institutions that operated there was the Royal Aero Club of South Australia, which was a training school. And obviously all around Australia in the 20s and 30s, these aero clubs, there was a bit of a movement where they were all constantly badgering the government for subsidies, saying that, you know, we're a national asset. When a war comes, we'll be able to train all the air crews you needed. And so when the war did start, the Aero Club there, they did train a couple of small classes of RAAF trainees. But the problem they had was, one, virtually all their instructors were RAAF reservists who were trained up to go to war themselves. And then obviously the RAAF, they didn't need just, you know, little classes of 6 and 10 people here and there. They needed hundreds and thousands of graduates. So they needed an industrial pipeline of people. So number 1 elementary flying training school took over basically the handful of planes and things the Aero Club had, and then very quickly expanded with everything after that, which basically consisted of lots and lots of tiger moths, and you can see one there on the apron at Archerfield with one of the old Guinea Airways hangars in the background. This is one of the typical classrooms they used, obviously with all the models for ship and plane recognition. And the second base we look at is Mount Gambier. And the interesting thing about Mount Gambier was that there was RAAF interest in having a base here from the late 1930s, and possibly from what we can deduce, this relates from the fact that it was quite common for squadrons of planes from Laverton to have navigation exercises over there. So it was about 250 miles away, so it was a nice little distance for them. And so I think the RAAF was quite familiar with it, but strangely, Mount Gambier does not have great weather all year round. It's quite a wet and rainy, cloudy place in the winter, and so it didn't meet that the criteria I showed early on. But they did set up number 2 observer school there. You can see in this slide, initially they used some de Havilland Dragons and so forth when there was a shortage of Ansons, but then they basically had about 30 Ansons, and they ran navigation courses there throughout the war. And this is a Anson flying over what is well known here. It's called the Blue Lake in Mount Gambier, and it is blue. Now, there are not very many photos of sort of the base infrastructure of many of these bases all around Australia. So this is quite an interesting one, which I got from a private collection, and it shows the sort of tower building, if you like, and the sort of at Mount Gambier with all the guys doing their pre-flight checks and plans for the day's training. And this is something I found in the RAAF Museum, which is a sort of something that was obviously put together informally by some staff of that school, and obviously they were quite proud of what they did. There's the it's sort of like a badge or logo, if you like, and it has a bomb in the middle showing that they realised they were at war, and it's obviously got the single wing for training of an observer and navigator, sort of a lightning bolt indicating maybe radio waves. I think it's a navigator's sextant and I think a aiming device of some kind. So it's quite interesting that even at this school they had a little bit of sort of esprit de corps or what have you.
Can you just go back for a second?
Yeah.
That's a set of protractors, which would have been for mapping.
All right. Attractor, I said sextant, yes.
Yeah, and that's the computer that they used back in those days there. And
cheers, Bob. Thank you. So by far the biggest base here was the number 6 Service Flying Training School at Mallala, and this is where if you've done your elementary training on a Tiger Moth and you're selected for dual engine or future bomber or transport sort of use, you go here and get your dual engine training on Hansons. They had a very large fleet there, up to 140 of them at one stage, and they were very, very busy. There was over 5,000 hours of flying per month at the peak of operations, and they trained over 2,200 pilots. But I think one of the reasons they needed so many Hansons is that there was a hell of a lot in maintenance at any one time, probably up to half of that fleet. And this is another interesting shot. It shows an Anson at Mallala in winter 1942. And as you can see, there's not a great amount of grass there. They had enormous amounts of problems with mud in the winter and then dust in the summer. And there were 1 or 2 years where they had way below average rainfall, and dust was a really massive problem. And then later in the war, they used lots of Oxfords. I think they were pretty handy trainers, but probably just because they all had brand new engines, they were a lot less maintenance heavy than the existing fleet of Ansons. So probably the most interesting base was number 2 Bombing and Gunnery School at Port Pirie. And this was by far the largest in area because you had the airfield and then you had several very large weapons bombing and gunnery ranges which went down the coast for I think 10 or 20 miles. It's sort of mangroves coast there, so it's very shallow, and I think you can sort of drop practice bombs in the mud and retrieve them and that sort of thing. And they also had a marine section which towed targets and everything offshore, so there was quite a variety of training they could do. They used ferry battle bombers, which dated from the 1930s, but they were pretty much obsolete in 1940 when they saw some service at the Battle of France and so forth. And so they were sent out here and I think to Canada, and they became quite useful training aircraft. They was quite docile to fly. And you can see here they had quite a big sort of fuselage that you had the pilot up the front, and then you could actually house 3 trainees and an instructor, either in gunnery instructor or a bombing instructor. So for gunnery training, each of these trainees would have a belt of 303 ammunition around their shoulders. They'd get aboard the plane, and each belt would be tipped in a different colour. So when they fired at a drogue target towed behind another Anson, each of the 3 would have their shots at firing it, and then they'd cut loose and would be recovered, and they'd see what sort of score each trainee got by seeing the colours of the bullet holes in the target. Now for bombing training, there was, if you imagine someone lying prone, basically where the wing crosses the fuselage, and they opened up this sort of window that just opened out up into the air to do the bomb training, bomb aiming. And apparently it was very, very unpopular because you had all the glycol fumes coming in. So a lot of people got really sick. And then just with the way their head was resting and looking down and with all the motion, a lot of them got quite sick with nausea as well. So it wasn't the most popular thing to be doing. And then there were these target tug battles, which were painted high-vis yellow and black, and these ones towed the targets behind them with a couple of 1,000 feet of cable, I think, and they would fly sort of next to or at cross paths to the gunnery battles, and it was sort of it was all stuff from sort of the 1930s when there were open cockpit guns and everything like that, and it was very, very dangerous because you had all these planes flying around, some with targets towed behind them. They were trying to get set up at the right angle to other planes, or they were flying to the place where they'd release the drones to fall to the ground. And a lot of these pilots, they've just had a training school themselves, so there were a lot of accidents. It was really dangerous. At the same time, actual combat conditions and the planes being used in service, they were getting faster and faster, and they had enclosed electric turrets and so forth, and there were all kinds of ground training aids that were being used for those. So yeah, this two bags, as they called it, bombing gunnery school was closed at the end of 1943. In the last 2 years, the war port period was used still with Ansons for navigation training, and so that's the graduation parade at Port Pirie. And so, just looking at some of the wartime operations in South Australia, and I know coming from Queensland, you think, well, what sort of war do they have in South Australia? And obviously not much of a hot one, but all of these bases almost had these reserve squadrons that were formed mainly with Ansons, but there was a battle reserve squadron as well that would have been used if the country was invaded or what have you. And these reserve squadrons, I think it was number 70 and 67 at Mallala and number 72 at Port Lincoln, they did patrol the coast quite a bit. And what was very no Japanese submarines ever came this side of Bass Strait as we know it. But the thing of national importance that was being sent from South Australia was we had the nation's only working iron ore deposits at just behind Whyalla. So those ships would take the iron ore from there in Spencer Gulf around to Wollongong and Newcastle, and a number of those ships were actually sunk during the Japanese submarine operations off New South Wales. One of the most interesting bases built came out of the sort of invasion war emergency planning in 1942, when there was a plan for a whole series of airfields around Adelaide, one for fighters and one for dive bombers, and each one would have various satellites around it, and it was quite elaborate plans. But the only one that really got off the ground was Gawler, which was meant to be the dive bomber base. And so this is Gawler being built by the local highways department, probably circa 1942, early 1943. It was completed in the first months of 1943. And Gawler's just a short distance north of Parafield. And probably the reason for building it was they knew Parafield was very busy with the training planes, but also there was still lots of civilian airline activity going on there even during the war. There were two very large runways built at Gawler. This is an overhead shot. One was bitumen, one was concrete. So one's quite dark coloured, one's quite light coloured. And this was the only hardened runways anywhere in South Australia up until West Beach Airport was opened, I think, in 1954. So there was some brief use of Gawler, even though there were no facilities there whatsoever. 86 Squadron was formed there in March 43, flying P-40M Kitty Hawks, and it moved to New Guinea soon afterwards. But it always had an attachment to Gawler because one of its young pilots was from the area, had been to Gawler High School, and he was actually killed in September 43. But I think through him, they all had good social contacts during their sort of couple of months in Gawler, even though they were basically camped at the showgrounds because there was nothing at the airfield whatsoever. And post-war, this 86 Squadron always held its reunions at Gawler. Number 21 Squadron, that was a Buffalo Squadron originally that served in Malaya, but it was reformed as a dive bomber Voldy Vincent Squadron, and that was another one that was briefly at Gawler for a couple of months before it moved up to New Guinea. Gawler's hardened runways were really good for large planes such as liberators, Bob, if this will wake you up. And the obviously a lot of the Americans at that time they'd love to have their recreation leave in Brisbane or Sydney or what have you. But the 380th Bomb Group, which was a B-24 unit up in the Northern Territory, they were told to start visiting Adelaide because everywhere else was so busy. And initially they sort of said, oh, Adelaide's this sleepy little place. Why would we want to go there? But they actually fell in love with the town. And recently we found out that the local Naval Air Force and Military Club, it was actually private. It was held during the war. And recently someone had dug up their visitor book and basically for a whole year, all their visitors were officers from the 380th Bomb Group. So they would come down here from the Northern Territory for their rest and recreation leave, and then the Liberators would be loaded up as sort of fat cats full of here they're loading milk and ice cream and so forth. Um, and they were quite regular visitors. Later on, it was used both for Liberators and Castrians operated by Qantas that were flying across the Indian Ocean, touching down at Learmonth and flying to Mascot. But sometimes, depending on the winds and various other things, they would use Gawler. Now, when Gawler was designed, obviously the government was really worried about invasion and everything, and of course they wanted all these hardened bunkers and everything. And it seems that it's very easy for the government to let contractors out, but it's very hard to sort of undo them. So even though these bunkers were never really needed, they were finished sort of in mid-1944. I guess it took them that long with materials and labour shortages and so forth to build them. And there's always been sort of this local verbal history about secret bunkers and stuff in Gawler, but they did exist, and a lot of them exist to this day on private properties, and some of them are part of houses. And they were used briefly for the Gawler telecommunications unit that was staffed largely by WAAFs, which handled all the RAAF radio and telephone traffic sort of in the last year or two of the war. But it was very underutilised and it was closed in March 1946. We didn't have too many operational squadrons here in South Australia, but number 34 Squadron, a transport squadron, was one. It was originally in the Northern Territory. It reformed here in start of 1943 with de Havilland Dragons, and it was basically flying career flights up to the Northern Territory and back. And obviously a Dragon couldn't take a very high payload, and it needed quite a number of stops on the way to get there and back. And so it was it really was hard work until they started getting some C-47s, and that obviously led to a quantum increase in capability, and soon they were flying to all parts of Australia and the Pacific, and it got so busy that in 1944 the Tiger Moth Training School, I think that was moved out to Tamworth. Also late in the war, we had a British transport squadron here, which was very large. It had 30 Dakotas. It flew in from India, and it was at Archerfield for about 6 or 7 months. The reason for it coming here was to support the British Pacific Fleet, because they thought that the war might go on for years and years, not knowing about the atom bombs and so forth. And so there was this enormous sort of logistical planning going on to support maybe British Pacific Fleet operations for quite a few years with Australia as a key base. There were a couple of radar units in South Australia at Cape Jarvis and Wedge Island, and these were operational. And again, there wasn't really the possibility of many enemy planes flying around down here, but these could detect surface submarines. So again, the idea was that at the entry to the two Gulfs, where Adelaide is and also Whyalla, Gulf St Vincent and Spencer Gulf, these radar units could potentially detect if there was some submarine activity. And we never had Japanese submarines here, but a German submarine did come through South Australia in 1944 and create a bit of a flap, and I think it attacked a merchant ship off the coast near Mount Gambier. So there were this slide, by the way, shows the Malabar War Cemetery, which isn't very large. There were a number of fatalities there, but by the time this was built, a lot of those people had been sent home to their home states for burial in other cemeteries. But basically, my research identified 147 members of the RAAF killed between the start of the war and 30th of June 1947. 86 or almost 60% were killed in flying accidents. And most of these accidents were during the peak of operations between 1941 and 1943, when the whole EATS thing was mushrooming. There was enormous demand for airmen, and probably the quality control and oversight wasn't as good as it became. The worst accident here was when two Ansons collided over the Murray River in 1942, killing 8 persons. And not surprisingly, there were 5 accidents involving ferry battle target tugs. Lots of train accidents, often in darkness or clouds, sometimes with solo pilots. But there were relatively few training accidents from 1944 onwards, and in the first months of 44, the training output was still quite high, but obviously the safety got pretty good. And of course, there were various other deaths from all the other illnesses and accidents and so forth you get with a bunch of people serving anyway. So just a quick look at some of the legacy of these bases and what's still there today. So this is Archerfield Airport, probably about 10 years ago, and you can see that line of hangars, if you remember the slide from earlier. Essentially, they're the same wartime hangars that have been there for many decades now. I think within living memory, the last few decades, you could drive around behind those hangars and see some of the wartime buildings of various kinds used for various things, but they're virtually all gone now, and most of those buildings are new. And there's been a big commercial flying training school there, and lots of those buildings relate to that. This is Gawler Airport, which is one of the most fascinating things because it's these massive sealed runways that are still there. Essentially, the wartime runways, really well built. They've had, they don't really do it anymore. There's just a soaring club there, and I think some firefighting planes use the field regularly in the summer. And one of the runways has sort of been cut off by a big motorway, which was developed about 10 or 15 years ago. But back in the 90s, they had, I think, the last big air show, and they had Hercules and various things landing there, no problem. One of the other peculiarities a RAAF air traffic controller told me about is this is good, quite close to RAAF Edinburgh, and so it's got its own tiny little protected air traffic control sort of zone for these gliders, and it's quite a peculiarity. This is a hangar at Port Pirie, one of the original wartime ones, as you can see, used by civil planes. This is one of the old gunnery butts that's still there at Port Pirie. Obviously, it's sort of on airport land, but it's just too big and too expensive to demolish over the years, so it's stayed there. There's also one of these at RAAF Mallala, which I've since had access to, which has been a privately owned racetrack or motor vehicle sort of testing track for many years. And I wasn't able to access it back then, but I've since been there, and it has a similar structure still standing. Some of you will be aware of this ferry battle that was recovered from mangroves outside Port Pirie in the mid-1970s. It's currently being restored at the South Australian Aviation Museum, and there's very, very few ferry battles in the world. So I think this is one of maybe just 3 or 4. And it didn't look much like a plane then, but it's looking much more like it now. And they got some wings to match it from the RAAF Museum at Hendon, which were some surplus wings from a Canadian battle. So that should be getting towards display condition in the next few years. One of the Ansons that originally served at Mallala that was rescued from a farm, like many of them, many years ago, and again that's quite an old photo. It's almost fully restored now. This is a private museum at Greenock in the Barossa Valley. it's not that well known. Maybe some of you have been there, but it's quite fascinating. It has a number of Ansons. This is probably the one in the best condition. It also has a Oxford sort of cockpit section, and being wooden planes, very little, I think, Oxford or Oxford related sort of airframes exist today at all. So that's it. Thanks for listening. And anyone have any questions or anything?
Thanks, Peter. There's quite a few ensigns now have been rebuilt. In fact, South Australia was a mine of ensigns at one stage.
Yeah.
Again, another one of the. If you've gone through Jeff Goodall's website pages, it'll be full of ensigns.
Yeah. Well, again, a couple of the people of Jeff Goodall's vintage, Nigel Dorr and David Vincent and Kevin Gogler and so forth, they were involved in that battle recovery, and they were also some of the people who went sort of farmhouse to farmhouse in the 70s and maybe the 80s looking for yeah, all these planes that were sold off surplus after the war, and of course, you know, farmers just bought them, so it was really hard to get machinery of any kind, and they kind of thought, you know, maybe these things would be useful, and they, as you know, became chicken coops and 100 other things, and some of the engines and machinery were found various usage. I think there's been you know, undercarriages and tires seen on farm carts and trailers and all that kind of stuff.
They're a very good source of nuts and bolts,
Nuts and bolts, indeed.
which were very hard to come by.
And I think because the climate here is quite dry, they could sit
Yeah,
farm shed and they wouldn't really you know, rust away too badly as they might elsewhere.
Hi, Peter. I'm Daryl at home in Chapel Hill, but I'm born and raised in South Australia, and I have lots of stories of my own, including in the late 1970s being an assistant barracks officer at Edinburgh, and the barracks officer had to do an audit of buildings around the state that he's responsible for, including what turned out to be one Bellman hangar at Mount Gambier that went missing. So it was stolen. And it turned out without having to send me there, he was able to get an explanation from the airfield that, they thought it was theirs and they gave it away to some other local flying club who came along, disassembled and took it away. So I don't know what the resolution was, but it wasn't just aeroplanes that were souvenired.
So one of those ones down there was still on the government inventory list in the 70s.
Yep.
Yeah, well, I know they lots of the buildings were used as scout halls and all sorts of things, and I think the civil aviation terminal at Mount Gambier was an ex-wartime building up until the 1980s when it was replaced.
Yeah, I don't remember much more of the details other than the boss wanted me to go look for it, but it turned up in the paperwork, so that was all right. The other thing I wanted to mention is that the Anson that's being restored at Amberley was a Malala veteran.
Okay.
So it's within a year of being finished, but it's, I don't know what color it's going to be. I don't know what it's going to represent, but there was strong preference to have it painted yellow in its final phases of usefulness. At the end of the Second World War, about 1944, a policy change changed them from camouflage to yellow. I'm wondering if you've got any images of yellow Ansons or black and white versions of it.
It's a really interesting question, and they had the same debate at the South Australian Aviation Museum. Some people wanted it camouflage, some wanted it yellow, and in the end they chose to do it trainer yellow. I actually, and again, there were so many Ansons serving around Australia, but there aren't that many photographs of them really, given the numbers around, especially on the bases. And I think there were two sort of categories, and if you had an Anson sort of fully kitted up, if you like, especially for those reserve squadrons, they certainly were camouflaged, and they had the turrets in, and they had the machine guns, they had the bomb equipment, they had radios, they also had flotation devices. So if they force landed in the water, and I'm told that if an Anson experienced an engine failure, it would just lose altitude because I don't think it could feather the sort of wooden propellers they had, and so they couldn't really fly that far off from the coast because they were constantly worried if they lost an engine, which they often did, and over the land, forced landing in a paddock was second nature. But having these things full of all the weight of all this equipment and fully camouflaged, I think there were some that were like that, but there were many that were just painted yellow and used for sort of dual engine training, and they didn't need all that other stuff in them.
Well, we when we got the Hulk to start the restoration, it was definitely yellow, and it had the turret removed and all warlike. Had no nose gun and no turret, and it was yellow. So when you look back in its records, it went into deeper level maintenance at what's it called, Guinea Airways in Archerfield. And we suspect the new policy was out just then, and it said any aircraft going into deeper maintenance, you're going to convert them to yellow. Unfortunately, during restoration, they equipped it with a turret, a nose gun, bomb bay, everything else. And then when it came time to decide, okay, guys, what are we going to paint it? Dave Gardner says yellow. Hang on. Well, it wasn't restored in the configuration of the yellow aircraft. So who knows what's going to happen? It's yet to be resolved.
I presume you don't have a turret for it or anything like that?
Yeah, we made one.
Oh, you made one?
Yeah. So we got a lot of, I think South Australian Aviation Museum shared a lot of spares with the project. And
got a whole shed full of stuff. I don't even know what it is, half it.
Yeah, well, you guys were, big assistant help in the project, both with, plans and research and spare parts. I know that much. Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see what they do. I said to them if it's going to be yellow, it's not coming here, because nothing north of the border was yellow.
You want some camouflage stuff at Amberley?
Well, it would just be irrelevant.
I believe at the start of the war, the service flying training school that was at Amberley, it basically, they had more important things to do there, sort of February, March 42. So I think that just closed down and virtually everything was shipped to Mallala, I believe.
Yeah. Oh, well, it went to all the other schools. They also tried to open, they did go to Mallala, but there was a couple of other inland Queensland centres that opened up. But it was, the main reason was accident rate at Amberley with the grass strip in our heavy rain, boggy floodplain. They were having a lot of ground incidents as well.
Yeah.
No,
I can only presume before the Pacific War started that there was a lot of pressure on the government to evenly distribute these training bases to all the states for political reasons, even though the Air Force had said sort of the Riverina area was the best place to have them. So maybe that's part of the reason there was a little school in Launceston and WA and obviously Queensland and arguably maybe the weather wasn't so good with the wet season you have, and also when the war came, it was you had better things to do, like
a lot of other things overtook it. Yes, so it became a depot. Nothing like Townsville, but it was very much a maintenance and readiness depot. Lots of squadrons formed up here and in the local area, Kingaroy, Lowood, Oakey.
Yeah.
So, yeah. No, I enjoyed that. All those places I've been to.
Oh, good.
As a kid. Yeah.
I think you've got to remember that the ensigns were all British built. They came out here in a box. They put them together with the RAAF markings, top colours and bottom colours, and that's the way they started out. They didn't have time to repaint them back in those days, in the early part of the war. And just one other thing there too, about the propellers. There's certainly not any. They were fixed pitch on both Ansons and Oxfords. Oxfords had wooden props, and Ansons had varied. Fairy Reed was the company, and they were at big, heavy aluminium ones. There were two of them at one stage lying underneath a building at Coolangatta Airport, and I so nearly pinched one when I was a kid, but I think it was too heavy for me.
Just to comment on the terminal building at Archerfield, it's almost identical design to the one that we have our meetings in at Archerfield Airfield.
Yeah, I have heard that. So it must have been a common DCA design, or
It was. The cabin is different. The ATC cabin up the top's different. That's for sure.
Yeah, that's different, but there is another difference. On the second floor, part of the building wasn't built at Archerfield. It's a bit missing either side.
And of course, there's the third building I go to Sydney at Mascot. The remnants of which are still there.
Yep.
They're surrounded by other buildings and you wouldn't notice it. But if you're driving into the domestic area of Sydney Airport, you go up and you turn right and you turn right. You've got Qantas on your left then. At the end of that road, that's where that building still is. But you can barely see it because the road beside it on the southern side and other stuff around it too. It too had a control tower in the top of the building. And back in the 70s, TAA used to use that, what had been a control tower, the TAA operations control. But of course, there are three other big control towers in Sydney Airport since then.
When I was in working in the country in Queensland in a bank, I used to go up to Kingaroy to glide, and there was an ensign on the side of the road on the way in from Bell to Kingaroy, and I'm pretty sure it was actually on Joe Bjelke's land, Joe Bjelke Peterson's land. And I took some quite good photographs of that aircraft, colour slides, and it was just faded yellow at that stage, which would be what you would expect from 1944 onwards.
One thing back on topic, Malala lasted up until the 1950s, until Edinburgh came along, didn't it? Malala was still quite functional.
Yeah, so it's again there's a reservist group captain here who's doing a lot of research into it, and that's possibly going to be the subject of a book that will come out in due course. But I think they closed it briefly, but they didn't sell it off because they had ideas for it, and so it all related to the weapons research with the British out at Woomera and Maralinga and so forth. And so when that started happening, they really needed a support base. And so they had Bristol Freighters based there. I think it was 34 Squadron. They also had a reservist Mustang Squadron, number 24 Squadron, that was there throughout the 50s. But sort of during this period, they wanted something closer to the industrial sort of DSTO type stuff that was all around Salisbury. And that's when they built, Edinburgh, basically. And so, and I think for a number of years, Edinburgh, it wasn't technically an RAAF base, it was a joint facility. And so the RAAF sort of hedged their bets and kept Malala going, and then they realised, well, we sort of need a sealed runway and all that sort of stuff. So it never had a sealed runway. It had sealed tarmac and so forth, or aprons, but I don't think a proper runway at Mallar, and pretty much by the end of the 50s, it had shut down. But they had some really big air shows there back in those days that lots of people have photos from. And one of the debates down here is that one of the air shows shows a Canberra bomber having landed there on a grass runway, and people sort of think, well, could a Canberra land on a grass runway? Apparently it could, but anyway.
Could always land there, but whether it took off again might matter
Exactly.
whether how wet or how dry it is.
Yeah, yeah.
And your jet wash on takeoff is going to be nasty.
That's right.
Yeah, all those things.
All right, gents, I think that would seem to have covered our evening. Has anybody else out there in La La Land got anything to add or question?
Oh.
All right, well, I'll hand back to Peter, who can close the recording down, which I don't believe has been done as prior to this, and bid us good night.
Yeah, well, thanks, everyone.
And thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter.